So in our last videos, we set up the actual producers for our Fox, initial part of our Fox system, but we now want connections between those things. Like we want the foxes to be able to eat from the food bucket or eat if the player gives them a piece of food. So to do that, we have to set up a buff. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy the watered buff, because it's the closest in functionality to what we want right now. And we're gonna just call it let's just call it a fox food buff. We have to give it a unique storage ID. We have to give it an amount of time that it lasts. So for now, let's say it lasts for 30 seconds. And max stacks we can leave set as 1 for now. I think that's all we'll do for that. So the fox food buff now exists in the game. That tells the system that the buff exists, but we need something to receive the buff and potentially something to give off the buff, right? So if we go here, we can see that the top thing up here is the buff that we're actually using for our soil. So we actually have it twice. We have it once on the actual placeable here, and we have it once on the producer. They're both things are looking for the watered buff for slightly different reasons. I think in our case we might be able to get away with just doing it as a placeable. No, we need a producer. Let's go here. We're going to copy this one here and we're going to paste it. So we're in the producer buffs table. We're going to use the same buff ID that we just set up previously. I'll sometimes write in or out on the name of a buff to remind myself which set of properties I'm selecting. So in this case, the producer is listening for the fox food buff, so that's why I called it fox food in. We want it set to can receive. We already have a buff duration over here, so that should be fine. We're going to set it to drain while empty, drain while placed, drain while building. This just means that the buff can be consumed while it's in all of those states. We can also, if we want, remove it on collect. So that means that your fox, like once you've clicked the heart, then he's hungry right away again, or she. Remove on producer removal is probably fine in our case. So here's the really important one. It's required to start building. So that's really what we want the most. We want it so that your fox won't start making a heart until this has happened. But then we have required while building, required while rebuilding. We probably don't need those because we can make it so that, as long as you feed the fox the once, it'll produce a heart, right? So we can actually uncheck those if we want. If we do that actually, then we probably don't need these other drain states either. We can probably just leave remove on collect. So let's try that. If this doesn't turn out quite the way we want, we can always tweak all these settings later. Let's just try it like that. We don't need it to affect the build rate. Yeah, well, we'll just leave it like this and see what it is. Then we're not going to do anything with expiry. We don't need a build rate multiplier. The tool, though, that we're going to use to add it, we're actually going to use the names of the specific items that we set up. So let's go and find those. We're going to want grapes, apple, brown mushroom. Tools consumed per use 1. This is just a hint for the player. Leave that at 0.8. We'll probably put in like an eating sound or something into the buff effect, but it's not mandatory, so we'll leave it for now. We're not going to modify the drops, and we're not going to output a buff. We're only inputting a buff here. So we made that, but there's nothing listening for it. We have to have something actually listening for this ID. And there's a couple places you can do this. So right here, you'll see that this is a placeables table, And the placeables table can take placeable buff IDs, but it also is able to take producer buff IDs, and any producers that are planted in the placeable will respond to that buff ID. So that's how the soil, clay pot, and the clay pot with cage and the tree spot, they're all listening for the same soil producer buff ID. So I think we're just going to do that. We're just going to put this right here. The other option would have been to make each separate producer listen for that. So we could have gone here and we could have put it inside each of the foxes. That would also be a legitimate place to put it. It would work either way. They have their own column for a producer buff ID. But it's easier if we just put it in one spot, so let's put it here in the producer buff IDs column of the placeables table. So let's hit File, Save All, and let's just go see if this works. Okay, so to test out what we just did, we need to try and feed these guys. If we click on them now, they say foxes need food to produce hearts. So let's try that out. Let's give them something to eat. Click on that and you can see that it's now producing heart. It's going to take 30 seconds. Let's try feeding the other ones. I would obviously use much longer timelines than 30 seconds. I don't want my player to be standing around here just feeding these foxes over and over. For the sake of testing it and getting it running, it's useful to pick nice short times. Okay, there we go. We can click on it, select a heart. So that's all good. That's working the way that we would like it to. But the other thing we'd like to do is make it so that these hunger symbols only show up above the fox when it's actually hungry. So let's see if we can figure out how to do that. So we're going to need first that base itself. We'll pull out the client and the static just so that we know what we're looking at. But the thing that we actually need to change here is going to have to be in the client. So that's the client here. So let's de-instance this template. And here's the thing we're going to want to turn on and off. This is the hunger symbol. And to turn it on and off, we're going to use a reactive component, which is a special script that's been included in this farming framework that can react to some producers and crafting and some other things. So let's go find the one we want. So let's go into the reactive components and just sort of read through the list till we find the one that seems best here. Let's try toggle visibility with active buff. You can see that it's looking for a buff ID. We can get that from the table we just made. That's here. This buff, we called it fox food. The object to toggle is this folder or this template that has the art in it. So we'll put that there. And we want it to hide when it receives that buff. Let's just do this and see if that works. Make sure you don't leave things like that in your scene once you're done working with them, because they might throw errors at you. These scripts are meant to be spawned into specific places, and if they're not in those places, then they can have errors. So everybody has a symbol above them right now, which is what we would expect because they're all hungry. So, oh yeah, there. We fed it and its hunger symbol went away. That's good. And we collected and the hunger symbol came back. So that's perfect. That's exactly the behavior that we want. They all seem to be working very well. Okay, so the next thing we're going to learn about is how to make the food bucket work, but we'll do that in a separate video just to keep these short.